My name is Riley, and I am 30 years old. Until 3 weeks ago, I thought I had the perfect life, the perfect marriage, and the perfect family. I was so incredibly wrong. If you are watching this right now, please hit the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from, as I take you through a nightmare that completely destroyed my reality and led to a conclusion no one could have ever predicted. It was a Sunday evening, exactly 7 o'clock. The kind of Sunday where the neighborhood is quiet, families are having dinner, and the world feels peaceful. But inside my house, the silence was suffocating. I stood in the middle of my living room, staring blankly at the front door. My eyes burned from crying, and my body felt heavy, weighed down by a relentless exhaustion over the past 21 days. For 3 entire weeks, my husband David had been completely missing. He did not leave a note. He did not send a single text. He just walked out one morning wearing his usual suit and vanished into thin air. At first, I was terrified. I called his office, hospitals, and police. The authorities said adults are allowed to leave, but my heart refused to accept it. David was the chief financial officer of a major healthcare conglomerate. He was a professional, the father of my 5-year-old son Leo and 3-year-old daughter Mia. He would never just abandon us, or so I thought. Every day of those 3 weeks was a living hell. I had to wake up every morning and look into the innocent faces of my children. Leo would run to the door every time a car drove past, asking when Daddy was coming home. Mia would cry at bedtime because David always read her a story. Upstairs, Leo and Mia were finally asleep. It had taken me over an hour to calm Mia down. She had been crying for her father, clutching the small stuffed bear he had bought her just a month prior. The emotional toll of telling them a fabricated story about a business trip to protect their hearts was tearing me apart. I had to swallow my panic, force a smile, and tell them Daddy was coming back soon. I was dying inside. I could not sleep or eat. I had stepped back from my career as a cybersecurity consultant to freelance from home, relying entirely on the stability David promised. Now that stability was gone, replaced by a gaping void of unanswered questions, the sudden chime of the doorbell shattered the heavy silence of the house. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. For a split second, a wild, desperate hope flared inside me. Maybe it was David. Maybe he had lost his phone or had amnesia, or was finally coming back to explain everything. I practically ran to the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I swung the heavy wooden door open, the desperate words of relief already forming on my dry lips. But it was not David standing there. Standing there was Beverly, my mother-in-law. She looked immaculate, as she always did. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and she wore a crisp, cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my first car. In her hands, she held several glossy gift bags from high-end toy stores. "Riley, darling," Beverly chirped, her voice dripping with a sugary sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "I came to see my beautiful grandchildren. Where is my brilliant, handsome son?" She did not wait for an invitation. Before I could even answer, Beverly pushed past me and stepped right into the foyer. She brought a cloud of heavy perfume that instantly overpowered the stale air. I closed the door slowly, feeling my energy drain away. Beverly stood in the entryway, her sharp eyes darting around the room. She was not just looking at the house, she was assessing it. I watched as her gaze swept over the hardwood floors, lingered on the expensive artwork, and finally settled on the slightly messy living room where Leo and Mia had left their building blocks scattered. Her nose wrinkled ever so slightly in distaste, a microscopic gesture of judgment that I had endured for 6 years of marriage. She always had a way of looking at my home as if she were a real estate inspector, evaluating a property rather than a grandmother visiting her family. But in that moment, I was too exhausted to care about her silent criticism. I was drowning, and Beverly was the closest thing to a lifeline I had. She was David's mother. Surely she would understand my terror. Surely she would share my desperate anxiety. I needed comfort. I needed someone to tell me that everything was going to be all right, that we would find David, that I was not alone in this nightmare. I took a deep breath, trying to push down the massive lump forming in my throat. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling completely vulnerable and incredibly small under her scrutinizing gaze. Beverly. I started, my voice cracking on the very first syllable. I do not know how to tell you this. I took another shaky breath, the warm tears welling up in my tired eyes. It is David. He has been missing for 3 weeks. I sobbed, the dam breaking. I could not hold it in anymore. The fear and utter heartbreak poured out. He has not called or texted. The police will not do anything. The kids keep asking for him. Beverly, I am so scared. We need to find him. I reached out, hoping she would wrap her arms around me. I stood there, tears streaming down my face, exposing the rawest parts of my pain. I waited for her motherly sympathy. I waited for her to comfort me. I waited for the warm embrace of a mother figure. I expected her to tell me we would call the police again and that everything would be fine. Instead, the cheerful grandmother facade melted away so fast it gave me whiplash. Beverly did not step forward to hold me. She took a deliberate step back, ensuring my tears would not somehow stain her immaculate blazer. Her lips pressed together in a thin, hard line, and the fake warmth in her eyes was replaced by a look of absolute chilling contempt. She looked at me not as a grieving wife in distress, but as a nuisance she was finally allowed to swat away. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. She did not gasp. She did not ask for details about her missing son. She simply stood there, perfectly poised, completely unfazed by the fact that he had been gone for 21 days. My sobs hitched in my throat. A cold dread began to pool in my stomach. Something was incredibly wrong. Beverly calmly reached into her designer handbag. She did not pull out a tissue for my tears or a toy for her grandchildren upstairs. Her manicured fingers withdrew a thick manila folder. She held it out toward me with casual indifference. The crisp white paper peeked out from the edges. I just stared at it, my tired mind struggling to process what was happening. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely grasp the folder when she pushed it forcefully against my chest. I opened the cover. The heavy legal jargon swam before my tear-filled eyes, but bold black letters at the top of the page brought my entire world to a grinding halt. Notice to vacate, eviction notice. I blinked hard, trying to force my brain to comprehend the words. My name was listed as the tenant. Beverly was listed as the property owner. Have you ever had the ground pulled entirely out from under your feet? Have you ever realized someone you trusted had been plotting your downfall the entire time? If you know what that kind of soul-crushing betrayal feels like, please hit the subscribe button and share your story in the comments. In that exact moment, standing in my foyer with an eviction notice, I realized monsters do not hide under beds. They sit at your dining table, eat your food, and smile at your children. I looked up from the document, the air knocked out of my lungs. I just did not understand. David and I bought this house together. We had spent 6 years making it a home. We had painted the nursery, planted the garden, and poured every ounce of our savings into the mortgage. I tried to speak, but my voice was barely a whisper. I asked her what this was. I told her this was my house, David's house. Beverly let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a sharp sound that echoed off the high ceiling of the entryway. She adjusted her handbag on her arm, looking at me with pure triumph. She told me it was not my house anymore. She explained with terrifying calmness that David had transferred the deed to her name weeks ago. The property belonged solely to her now. I was simply a guest who had overstayed her welcome. My knees felt weak. The hallway began to spin. David transferred the house. How was that even legally possible without my signature? How long had he been planning this? The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. David was not missing. He was not lying hurt in a ditch somewhere. He had not suffered a terrible accident or amnesia. He had planned this. He had carefully, methodically orchestrated his disappearance and left his mother to deliver the final blow. I asked her where he was. The desperation in my voice was replaced by a rising, frantic panic. I demanded to know where my husband was. Beverly smiled, a cold, predatory curve of her lips. She told me David did not disappear from the world. He disappeared only from me. She said he was exhausted from carrying the weight of my useless lifestyle, tired of providing for a woman contributing nothing. She told me he had simply removed himself from a toxic situation and was finally living the life he actually deserved, far away from my incompetence. The cruelty of her words was paralyzing. She stood in my home, the home she now legally claimed as her own, and casually informed me that the father of my children had discarded us like yesterday's trash. She knew exactly where he was. The entire family probably knew. For 3 weeks, while I called hospitals in a blind panic and held our crying children, they had all known. They had all likely been laughing at my frantic voicemails. I looked at the eviction notice again, the black ink blurring as fresh tears threatened to spill. 30 days. The document stated I had 30 days to vacate, but Beverly quickly corrected that assumption. She stepped much closer, invading my personal space. She informed me that the 30-day legal grace period was a formality she had no intention of honoring. She wanted me out immediately. My mind raced, trying to find a logical thread in this nightmare. I was a devoted mother with 2 toddlers asleep upstairs. I had given up my cybersecurity career to support David's rise. I had sacrificed my independence for our family. Now I stood in the hallway, penniless, with my mother-in-law ordering me out of my own home. This betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously executed, that it felt surreal. I gripped the manila folder until my knuckles turned white, the sharp edges of the paper cutting into my palms, grounding me in the terrifying reality that my husband was not a missing person. He was a traitor, and his own mother was the executioner. I stared at the eviction notice, my mind catapulted back through 6 years of a marriage built on calculated lies. It felt like a lifetime of devotion reduced to fraudulent papers. When David and I met, I was not the exhausted freelance worker standing in this foyer. I was a highly sought-after cybersecurity consultant. I hunted digital threats, built firewalls, and thrived in a high-stakes industry. I was sharp, independent, and at the top of my game. Then came love, followed by promises of a shared future. David was determined to conquer the corporate world. When Leo was born 5 years ago and Mia followed 2 years later, we made a joint decision. David convinced me that stepping back from my intense agency role to freelance from home would provide our children with the perfect upbringing. He promised to carry the financial burden so I could be the anchor our family needed. I willingly sacrificed the peak of my career to manage school pickups and keep our household running flawlessly. My sacrifice became the exact stepping stone David needed to secure his position as the chief financial officer at a large healthcare conglomerate. I managed every domestic crisis so he could attend late-night board meetings. I built the stable sanctuary he returned to after conquering his corporate battles. I gave him absolutely everything, trusting my career sacrifice was an investment in our family empire. Now, holding the eviction notice his mother just shoved into my hands, the cruel irony of that trust threatened to break me completely. Beverly watched my silent realization with a satisfied smirk. She told me I had wasted enough of her time and that I needed to start packing my bags immediately. She turned on her designer heel and walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind her with a definitive slam that rattled the windows. The sudden silence in the entryway was deafening. I was entirely alone. My hands trembled violently as the survival instincts I had suppressed for 6 years finally began to awaken. I dropped the eviction folder onto the console table. My breathing grew shallow and rapid. A terrifying thought struck me like a physical blow to the chest. If David had meticulously planned to transfer the deed of the house to his mother, what else had he prepared for his grand escape? I reached into my pocket with numb fingers and pulled out my smartphone. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I opened my banking application, the biometric scanner taking a second too long. The interface of our joint banking account materialized. I blinked hard, certain that my tear-filled eyes were deceiving me. I refreshed the screen. I swiped down, watching the loading circle spin. The numbers refreshed, but they did not change. Checking account balance $0.00. Savings account balance $0.00. Emergency fund $0.00. The accounts were entirely drained. Every single dollar we had saved over 6 years of marriage was gone. The money from my freelance projects, the savings for Leo and Mia to go to college, the emergency fund we built together. All of it had been systematically siphoned out. He had not just taken his own income, he had taken the money I earned and deposited into our shared accounts. He had left me completely destitute. My knees buckled. I sank to the floor, my back sliding down the painted wall of the foyer until I hit the baseboard. I sat there on the floor of a house that was no longer mine, staring at a bank balance that no longer existed. The sheer evil of his plan was paralyzing. David knew exactly what he was doing. By draining the accounts and transferring the house, he was leaving the mother of his children without a single resource to fight back. He wanted me broken, compliant, and unable to hire a lawyer. He wanted to discard me with absolute impunity. The panic began to rise in my throat, a primal terror. How was I going to buy groceries tomorrow? How was I going to pay for gas? Where were my children and I going to sleep? The questions spiraled out of control, threatening to pull me into an inescapable abyss of despair. I felt a scream building in my chest, but before that scream could tear its way out of my throat, a sound drifted down from the second floor. It was a high, thin wail, followed by a louder, frantic cry. Leo and Mia had woken up. The front door slamming must have startled them from their sleep. I heard the patter of small feet hitting the hardwood upstairs. Mommy, Leo called out, his voice trembling with fear. Mia wants Daddy. Where is Daddy? The sound of my children crying acted like a bucket of ice water poured directly over my head. The paralyzing panic instantly hardened into something entirely different. They were upstairs, frightened, confused, and looking for a father who had deliberately abandoned them without a second thought. They only had me. I was their only shield against the terrifying reality of what David had done. I could not fall apart. I could not let them see me broken on the floor. I locked my phone and shoved it back into my pocket. I closed my eyes for one brief second, mentally burying the helpless wife David expected me to be. I swallowed the thick lump of panic lodged in my throat. I pushed myself up from the floor, my legs shaking but holding firm. I wiped the tears from my cheeks. I took a deep breath, preparing to climb the stairs and comfort my children. I did not have a house, and I did not have a single dollar to my name, but I still had my mind. David had forgotten exactly who he married, and I was going to remind him. I hurried up the wooden staircase, rushing toward the nursery. I found Leo standing in the hallway holding his little sister's hand. Their tear-streaked faces looked up at me in the dim glow of the nightlight. I fell to my knees, wrapping my arms tightly around their small, trembling bodies, and whispered a gentle, steady lie. I told them Daddy's flight was delayed by a massive rainstorm, but everything was perfectly fine. I promised a special pancake breakfast in the morning, and guided them back to bed. I tucked the blankets under their chins, kissed their foreheads, and pulled the nursery door shut. The maternal warmth instantly hardened back into jagged ice. I turned toward the staircase, my mind calculating my next moves. I needed to survive. I made it halfway down the steps when the heavy front door swung open. There was no knock. There was no hesitation. The door burst inward, hitting the wall with a loud thud that echoed through the quiet house. I froze on the landing, my hand gripping the wooden banister. Rachel, David's younger sister, marched into the foyer. She was closely followed by her husband, Jamal. Rachel wore a smug, self-righteous expression that immediately made my blood boil. Jamal stepped in behind her, pulling the door shut. He was an impeccably dressed African-American man who carried himself with the intimidating aura of an untouchable corporate executive. As a senior credit director at a prominent local bank, Jamal treated every family gathering like a boardroom negotiation where he held all the leverage. Tonight he wore a tailored charcoal suit, his dark eyes locking onto me with freezing contempt. They did not bother greeting me. Rachel spotted me on the stairs and pointed a manicured finger toward the living room, gesturing for me to come down like a disobedient child. I descended the remaining steps slowly, keeping my face entirely blank. I walked into the living room and they immediately flanked me. Rachel positioned herself by the fireplace while Jamal stood blocking the archway that led to the kitchen. They had deliberately boxed me in, creating a physical barrier that mirrored the psychological trap their family had set. The air grew instantly heavy. I stood in the center of my own living room, feeling like a cornered animal surrounded by predators who had come to finish the hunt. Rachel did not waste a single second. She launched into a venomous, calculated attack, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. She told me I had no one to blame but myself. She spat out the words, her eyes flashing with a deep-seated jealousy that had always simmered beneath the surface of our interactions. She claimed I had suffocated her brother with my constant demands and my pathetic inability to contribute to the household. Rachel paced across the Persian rug, gesturing wildly as she painted David as a suffering martyr. She said he worked grueling 80-hour weeks to provide a lavish lifestyle while I sat around doing absolutely nothing. She called me a parasite. I stared at my sister-in-law, completely stunned by the aggressive rewriting of history. She knew perfectly well I was the one who funded David's early career. She knew I had stepped back from a lucrative cybersecurity position specifically to raise her niece and nephew. Yet she stood in my living room furiously rewriting my entire 6-year marriage to justify her brother's horrific betrayal. Rachel stepped closer, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. She yelled that David had finally woken up and realized his true worth. She claimed he was deeply depressed, trapped in a miserable marriage with a woman who had completely let herself go. Every word she spoke was a deliberate, agonizing twist of the knife designed to break down my self-esteem and make me believe I deserved to be abandoned. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to tell her about the drained bank accounts and the eviction notice, but a large hand suddenly raised in the air. Jamal stepped forward, his polished leather shoes silent on the rug. He did not yell or lose his temper like his wife. Instead, he used a terrifyingly calm, measured tone that demanded absolute silence. He looked down at me, utilizing every inch of his height and his professional banking authority to establish total dominance over the room. Jamal told his wife to calm down, stating that getting emotional with someone as irrational as me was a complete waste of their valuable time. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and crossed his arms, his dark, calculating gaze pinning me to the spot. He informed me he was here to ensure I understood the gravity of my financial reality. He spoke with the clinical detachment of a bank executive foreclosing on a ruined business. Jamal stated that my emotional manipulation would not work on him. He said they were fully aware of my attempts to bleed David dry, and that he had personally advised his brother-in-law on how to legally protect the family assets from a reckless spouse. He stepped even closer to me, completely invading my personal space. The heavy scent of his expensive cologne was suffocating. Jamal lowered his voice to a chillingly professional whisper, explaining that I was entirely out of my depth. He told me fighting this would be the biggest mistake of my life. He claimed my financial footprint was an absolute disaster, and I had zero leverage, zero resources, and zero chance of winning a legal battle against a family backed by top-tier financial executives. Jamal systematically began stripping away any remaining hope I harbored, using his banking expertise to gaslight me into believing the zero balance in my accounts was a direct result of my own negligence. He looked at me as a liability he had just successfully liquidated. I was now entirely trapped, facing a highly coordinated family ambush that was designed to completely destroy me. Jamal did not break eye contact as he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He withdrew a thick, tri-folded stack of glossy papers and tossed them onto the glass coffee table with a loud smack. The heavy silence in the living room was suddenly broken by the sound of the front door opening once again. Beverly stepped inside, returning. She had never actually left the property, likely waiting on the porch, just to make sure her daughter and son-in-law finished the psychological execution she had started. Beverly glided into the living room and stood right beside Rachel, forming a solid wall of hostility. The three of them loomed over me, a unified front of absolute malice. I looked down at the papers. Jamal pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the stack. He instructed me to pick them up and look at the financial ruin I had supposedly created. I reached out with trembling hands and pulled the documents onto my lap. They were credit card statements, bank ledger printouts, and loan originations, all bearing my name. The sheer volume of the paperwork was staggering. Jamal began his assault weaponizing his extensive banking vocabulary to paint me as a reckless, out-of-control spender who had single-handedly driven my husband to the brink of total bankruptcy. Jamal claimed my revolving debt utilization had reached catastrophic levels, asserting that my hidden retail expenditures and unapproved ledger withdrawals had pushed David's debt-to-income ratio past the point of no return. According to Jamal, my relentless lifestyle inflation had jeopardized David's corporate standing at the healthcare conglomerate. He threw around terms like asset liquidation, compounded default interest, and fiduciary negligence. He spoke so fast and with such aggressive confidence that a normal person would have been instantly crushed under the weight of his fabricated expertise. Jamal stated that David was drowning in toxic liabilities entirely generated by my insatiable greed, leaving him no choice but to initiate an emergency financial restructuring just to survive. I stared down at the first page of the statements. My heart was pounding, but my mind, trained by years of rigorous cybersecurity forensics, automatically began processing the data. I was not a financially illiterate housewife. I investigated digital fraud for a living. The moment my eyes focused on the transaction details, the illusion began to crack. The documents were completely fabricated. My analytical brain instantly recognized the glaring anomalies. The font kerning on the merchant headers did not match the standard typography used by that specific banking institution. The transaction dates overlapped in ways that were sequentially impossible for a standard billing cycle. Even the merchant category codes were completely wrong for the types of purchases listed. They had slapped my name onto a manufactured nightmare, probably generated by Jamal himself, using his insider banking software access. I gripped the edges of the fake statements, a surge of righteous anger temporarily overriding my shock. I opened my mouth, fully prepared to call out the impossible timestamps and the forged routing numbers. It was an amateurish forgery. But the moment I inhaled to speak, the verbal barrage hit me from all three sides, completely drowning out my defense. Rachel lunged forward, her voice a piercing shriek that cut through the room. She accused me of being a gold-digging parasite who only married her brother to drain his accounts. She waved her hands frantically, claiming I was too lazy to hold down a real job, perfectly content to bleed David dry while pretending to be a devoted mother. She yelled that I was a complete fraud, a toxic burden, finally exposed forever. Beverly immediately joined the assault, stepping closer to ensure I felt the full venom of her hatred. Her voice was cold, sharp, and dripping with aristocratic disdain. She told me I had ruined her son, destroying his bright future with my endless demands and my pathetic low-class sensibilities. Beverly hissed that David was a victim of my emotional and financial abuse, forced to flee his own home just to escape my suffocating incompetence. She pointed at the ceiling, bringing my children into her vicious tirade. Beverly claimed I was unfit to raise Leo and Mia, declaring that a woman who could not even manage a basic household budget had absolutely no right to call herself a mother. I tried to stand up, tried to raise my voice over their relentless shouting, but the sheer volume of their combined attack physically pushed me back down. Every time I opened my mouth to expose the fraudulent documents in my hands, Jamal raised his booming voice, overriding me with more aggressive banking jargon. He pointed at the fake statements, declaring that numbers do not lie, even though I knew for an absolute fact that these specific numbers were entirely fabricated. Jamal insisted that transferring the deed to Beverly and draining the joint accounts were completely legal, necessary measures taken by a desperate man trying to protect his remaining assets from a destructive spouse. He framed their blatant theft as a heroic act of financial preservation. Jamal looked down at me with profound disgust, stating that I was lucky they were only handing me an eviction notice instead of pressing criminal charges for financial fraud. The sheer audacity of his projection was breathtaking. He was the one holding forged banking documents, yet he stood there threatening me with the law. Rachel and Beverly continued to hurl insults, their voices overlapping into a dizzying, chaotic symphony of hatred. They called me worthless, crazy, and delusional, The three of them formed an impenetrable wall of sound and fury, giving me absolutely no space to breathe, let alone articulate a defense. I sat frozen on the sofa, clutching the fraudulent papers against my chest. The noise in the living room was deafening, a relentless psychological beating designed to break my spirit and force my complete surrender. They wanted me to believe their reality. They wanted me to accept that I was the villain of this story, completely responsible for my own sudden destitution. I bit the inside of my cheek hard, tasting the sharp, metallic tang of blood. The physical pain grounded me, keeping me tethered to the truth, while the storm raged around me. I let them scream. I let them hurl their fabricated accusations and their toxic, coordinated gaslighting. I remained silent, absorbing every single word, while the cold, calculating part of my mind quietly locked their faces into my memory, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. As accusations swirled, a sharp click of the front door latch cut the loud noise. The oak door swung open. Beverly, Rachel, and Jamal instantly ceased screaming. The abrupt silence was more terrifying than their shouting. I sat motionless, my knuckles white, gripping the forged documents. A tall figure stepped out of the shadows into the warm glow of the foyer chandelier. It was David. My husband was not missing. He was not injured or lying unconscious in a ditch. He looked impeccably groomed in a crisp navy suit. His face held no trace of guilt. He radiated an arrogant, untouchable confidence. The true gut punch came from the person behind him. David did not walk into our home alone. His right hand was tightly intertwined with the fingers of a young woman I recognized. Her name was Brittany. She was 25 years old, an intern in David's financial department for 8 months. I met her once at a holiday party where she played the eager, respectful junior employee. Tonight she wore a completely different mask. Brittany stepped into my foyer wearing a designer trench coat and a smug smirk mirroring my mother-in-law's expression. She clung to David's arm like a prized trophy, her eyes scanning my living room with a proprietary gleam. She looked at me sitting on the sofa without a single ounce of shame. It was a look of pure ownership. She arrived to claim her conquered territory. Before I could process my husband's infidelity, Rachel let out an excited squeal. She did not look shocked by her brother bringing his intern into my home. Instead, she shoved past Jamal and sprinted toward the foyer. Rachel threw her arms wide open and pulled Brittany into a massive theatrical embrace. She gushed with an affection she never directed toward me. Holding Brittany by the shoulders and beaming, she proclaimed that her sister-in-law was finally here. The words hit the room like a shockwave, settling deep into my chest. Sister-in-law. Rachel said it so casually, as if they had practiced this greeting 100 times before. My mind raced, connecting the dots at lightning speed. Rachel's welcome was not a spontaneous reaction to a new girlfriend. It was the comfortable familiarity of a long-standing relationship. Beverly stepped forward next, offering Brittany an approving smile and a gentle kiss on the cheek. Even Jamal nodded, raising his hand in a casual greeting. The realization crashed over me. They all knew. They had known for months. Every time David claimed he was working late, Beverly had been covering for him. Whenever Rachel invited me to agonizing brunches to complain about my lifestyle, she was keeping me distracted while her brother spent time with his mistress. They formed a unified syndicate to protect his infidelity. They sat at my table, ate the food I cooked, smiled at my children, and facilitated the destruction of my marriage. I stared at Brittany, my analytical eyes taking in every detail of her appearance. She carried a pristine handbag that retailed for more than $10,000. The diamond tennis bracelet sparkling on her wrist caught the light of the chandelier. The earrings, the coat, the expensive designer boots. My stomach churned as the puzzle clicked perfectly into place. I understood exactly where the money from my drained joint accounts went. The savings I scraped together from freelance projects, the college funds meant for Leo and Mia, the emergency stash I carefully built. David had not just liquidated our assets to protect himself. He stole my money to drape his young mistress in luxury. He funded his illicit romance with the financial security of his own children. The sheer audacity of the entire scene was suffocating. My husband stood in the foyer of the house I turned into a home, holding hands with the intern he bought with my money, while his mother, sister, and brother-in-law cheered them on. They deliberately staged this grotesque family reunion right in front of me to inflict maximum psychological damage. They wanted me to witness my own replacement. They wanted to humiliate me so profoundly that I would pack my bags and disappear without a fight. David finally locked eyes with me. His gaze was devoid of warmth. He looked at me the same way Jamal had, like an expired asset, a bad investment he was cutting loose. He squeezed Brittany's hand, reassuring his mistress that he was in total control. I remained seated on the sofa, the forged statements resting heavy on my lap. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I did not give them the hysterical reaction they desperately wanted to see. The tears that fell when Beverly handed me the eviction notice were completely gone, now dried up by the searing heat of absolute betrayal. The maternal instinct that drove me upstairs to comfort my crying children transformed into a cold, lethal resolve. They severely underestimated the woman they were trying to discard. They saw a defeated housewife cornered by gaslighting and cruel emotional games. They forgot I spent my career dissecting fraud, tracing hidden connections, and destroying digital criminals. David took a confident step down into the living room, pulling Brittany along with him. The entire family shifted, forming a semicircle around me, their faces painted with varying shades of arrogance and victory. They believed the ambush was complete. They thought displaying the mistress was the final devastating blow that would break my spirit forever. I slowly looked at each of their faces. Beverly with her aristocratic sneer, Rachel practically vibrating with jealous vindication, Jamal standing like a smug corporate enforcer, Brittany dripping in my stolen money, and David the coward who orchestrated it all. I took a slow, steady breath. Let them gloat, I thought. Let them enjoy this illusion of victory. Because the game was no longer about saving my marriage. It was about total annihilation. David broke the silence. He pulled out a thick envelope and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. The heavy packet landed on top of the fabricated credit card statements Jamal had provided. It slid slightly, stopping inches from my hands. Bold black letters on the front read, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." David looked down at me with supreme boredom. He sounded like a ruthless executive firing an employee. He told me to read the documents, mocking my mental capacity and doubting I could comprehend legal terms. He announced loudly that he was filing for full physical and legal custody of Leo and Mia. The audacity of his words sent a powerful jolt of adrenaline straight to my core. Leo and Mia were my entire world. I had put my cybersecurity career on hold specifically to nurture them. David had barely changed a diaper in 5 years. Yet he stood there acting as though he were the devoted primary caregiver. He paced across the Persian rug, laying out his fabricated case. He proclaimed my current emotional state proved I was entirely unfit to raise our children. He labeled me mentally unstable and a danger to their well-being. He claimed my complete lack of steady income meant I could not provide a safe home, ignoring the brutal fact that he and his mother had just maliciously drained my bank accounts. By taking sole custody, he would protect his wealth, avoid paying alimony, and sever my ties to my babies. Brittany leaned against his shoulder, nodding in agreement. She looked down at me with condescending pity. She whispered loudly enough for the room to hear that the children deserved a healthy environment, implying she was prepared to step into the role of their new mother. The sickening thought of this intern playing house with my children made my blood run cold. David stopped pacing and stood directly over me. He crossed his arms and delivered his final decree. He informed me that the 30-day eviction notice Beverly had handed me earlier was a courtesy they were no longer willing to extend. He told me I had exactly 48 hours to pack a single bag of clothing and walk out the front door forever. If I was not gone by Tuesday evening, he promised he would call the police and have me forcibly removed for trespassing. He warned me not to try taking the children, threatening that if I attempted to put them in my car, he would immediately have me arrested for kidnapping. I sat perfectly still on the sofa, processing the magnitude of their coordinated attack. They weaponized my maternal devotion, my financial vulnerability, and my emotional shock. They were trying to back me into a corner so tight that surrender would feel like my only option. I reached out slowly and placed my hand flat on the divorce petition. I did not open it. I looked up at David, maintaining a blank expression. My sudden lack of hysterics unsettled him for a fraction of a second. He glanced over his shoulder at Jamal, silently requesting backup. Jamal did not hesitate. He stepped out from the archway, walking right up to the coffee table. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the glass surface to bring his face level with mine. The smug confidence radiating from his dark eyes was suffocating. Jamal told me in a threatening tone that I needed to listen closely. He explained that if I decided to be difficult, if I refused to sign the divorce papers or attempted to fight David for custody, he would personally ensure I never recovered. He smiled, a terrifying, predatory grimace. He reminded me of his position as a senior credit director at the local bank. He promised to use every institutional connection and piece of financial leverage he possessed to permanently obliterate my economic identity. He boasted that he could easily attach fraudulent delinquency markers to my social security number. He threatened to flag my profile in national banking databases, ensuring my credit score plummeted into the absolute basement. He meticulously detailed how the financial system operates on fragile trust, and how easily a man in his prestigious position could poison that trust against me. He calmly outlined a nightmare scenario where I would never be approved for a residential lease, never secure an auto loan, and never pass a background check for a low-level job. Jamal swore he would make me a financial pariah. He said I would be utterly destitute, sleeping in homeless shelters, while David and Brittany raised my children in luxury. Rachel chimed in, her voice dripping with satisfaction. She advised me to take the meager settlement David offered and vanish. Beverly nodded her agreement, adding that fighting a prominent family with their massive resources was a suicidal endeavor. They stared at me, waiting eagerly for the inevitable breakdown. They wanted me to beg to collapse under the crushing weight of their combined threats. They expected a terrified, defeated housewife. But as Jamal sneered at me, boasting about his untouchable connections, a crucial piece of information locked perfectly into place inside my analytical mind. Jamal had just openly admitted in front of multiple witnesses to possessing the capacity to manipulate federal banking systems for personal vendettas. He practically handed me the definitive key to his own destruction. My cybersecurity training kicked into high gear. I mapped out the digital breadcrumbs he must have carelessly left behind while forging those statements. People arrogant enough to brag about crimes always leave a traceable digital trail. I slowly pulled my hand away from the divorce petition. I looked at Jamal, then at David, and finally at Brittany. I kept my breathing steady and my posture completely submissive. I knew that the only way to survive this 48-hour window was to play exactly the role they assigned me. I had to let them believe they had won. I had to let them revel in their fatal hubris. I lowered my eyes to the floor, staring at the polished wood beneath the rug, and prepared to deliver the performance of my life. I let my shoulders slump forward, forcing my breathing to become ragged and shallow. Slowly, I slid off the edge of the sofa and let my knees hit the Persian rug with a dull thud. I buried my face in my hands, summoning every ounce of terror I had felt earlier when I first saw the empty bank accounts. The tears came easily now, hot and heavy, spilling through my fingers and dropping onto the floor. I let out a loud, pathetic sob, making sure my voice trembled with absolute defeat. "Please," I begged, looking up at David through my tear-soaked lashes. "Please do not do this. I have nothing. Where am I supposed to go with Leo and Mia?" I shifted my gaze to Beverly, clasping my hands together like a beggar pleading for scraps. "You are a mother, Beverly. Please, I cannot put your grandchildren in a homeless shelter. Just give me a chance to figure something out." I let my voice crack on the final word, presenting myself as a thoroughly broken woman who had accepted her total destruction. The reaction in the room was exactly what I anticipated. The collective ego of the family swelled to monumental proportions. Rachel let out a high, triumphant laugh, clapping her hands together as if she were watching the grand finale of a brilliant stage play. She leaned against her husband, pointing at my kneeling figure and loudly whispering that I finally looked like the trash I truly was. Jamal simply adjusted his expensive tie, a dark smirk playing across his face. He looked down at me with the supreme satisfaction of a man who believed his threats had successfully crushed a rebellion before it even started. He clearly thought his banking jargon and intimidation tactics had broken my spirit entirely. Brittany stepped closer to David, wrapping both arms around his waist and resting her chin on his shoulder. She gazed down at me with mocking pity, thoroughly enjoying her victory. She whispered to David that it was almost sad watching me beg, stroking his ego by reminding him how much power he held over my miserable existence. David stood taller, expanding his chest as he soaked in the absolute submission I was performing. He looked at his mother, sharing a silent moment of supreme arrogance. They had won, and my public humiliation was their ultimate reward. I reached out and lightly grasped the hem of David's suit jacket. "I need a little more time," I pleaded, letting my voice drop to a pathetic whisper. "Just a few more days to find a cheap apartment. 48 hours is not enough to pack the kids' belongings and find a bed for them. Please, David, just give me a little more time, and I will sign whatever you want. I will leave quietly. I promise I will not fight you or Jamal. I will just go." David looked down at my hand on his jacket with deep disgust. He stepped back, forcing me to let go. He glanced at Beverly, seeking her approval. Beverly gave a slow, deliberate nod. She stepped forward, her designer heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. "We are not monsters, Riley," she said, her voice dripping with toxic benevolence. "We will give you 72 hours. That is 3 full days to pack your garbage and get out of my house. But if you are not gone by Wednesday night, Jamal will ruin your credit, and David will call the police. Do we have an agreement?" I nodded frantically, bowing my head so low it almost touched the carpet. "Thank you," I sobbed, forcing my voice to tremble. "Thank you so much. I will be gone, I promise." David sneered, kicking the divorce petition slightly closer to me. "Have the papers signed before you leave," he ordered. "Now get out of our sight. Go pack your bags." I scrambled to my feet, keeping my posture hunched and defeated. I did not look at any of them. I stumbled toward the staircase, leaning heavily on the wooden banister, as if my legs could barely support my weight. I heard Rachel snicker as I dragged myself up the steps, performing the role of the utterly vanquished wife to perfection. Every agonizing step I took fed their delusions of absolute victory. They wanted a shattered victim, and I gave them an Oscar-worthy performance. I reached the top of the landing and hurried down the dark hallway toward the nursery. I opened the door quietly and slipped inside. Leo and Mia were fast asleep, their chests rising and falling in a steady rhythm. I gently scooped Mia into my arms, pressing her warm face against my shoulder, and nudged Leo awake. I whispered that we were having a special sleepover in Mommy's big bed tonight. Still half asleep, Leo rubbed his eyes and followed me blindly. We moved quickly into the master bedroom. I guided them onto the large mattress and pulled the thick duvet up to their chins. They settled immediately, completely oblivious to the cruel war raging directly beneath them. I walked over to the heavy, solid oak door. I placed my hand on the brass lock and turned it. The instant that the metal lock engaged, everything changed. My tears stopped immediately. The frantic, trembling energy that had consumed my entire body vanished without a single trace. I stood up perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back to release the tension of my performance. My face hardened into a mask of pure calculating focus. I wiped the remaining moisture from my cheeks with the back of my hand. Downstairs, the monsters were pouring champagne, celebrating their flawless victory. They believed I was cowering in the dark, packing my bags in absolute total despair. They were so utterly wrong. The weeping housewife was completely gone. The cybersecurity expert was awake, and I had exactly 72 hours to burn their entire criminal syndicate to the absolute ground. I moved away from the bedroom door, listening to ensure no footsteps were approaching. Muffled sounds of clinking glasses and laughter drifted up through the floorboards. David and his accomplices were celebrating their perceived victory, oblivious to the lethal mistake they just made. They assumed I was a technologically illiterate dependent, easily crushed by Jamal. They forgot that before becoming a stay-at-home mother, I spent my days dissecting digital fraud, hunting corporate hackers, and building impenetrable network architectures. David always viewed my career as a quirky hobby, a phase I outgrew when Leo was born. His arrogant dismissal of my expertise was about to become the weapon of his absolute destruction. I walked past the bed where my children slept peacefully. I stepped into the walk-in closet, bypassing the racks of clothes David had mockingly told me to pack. I knelt on the carpet, reaching toward the back corner and pushing aside a row of winter boots. My fingers found the loose baseboard panel I installed years ago. I pried the wooden trim away, exposing a hidden wall cavity. Inside sat a heavy-duty shock-proof Pelican case. I pulled the black case out, brushing off dust. I carried it to the vanity table near the window, operating entirely by moonlight, filtering through the blinds so I would not alert anyone downstairs. I popped the latches and opened the lid. Nestled in custom-cut foam was my specialized tactical laptop, a machine built specifically for digital forensics and penetration testing. Beside it sat a row of encrypted USB drives, hardware tokens, and network adapters. This equipment was the digital equivalent of a sniper rifle, maintained meticulously in secret over the years. I updated the software patches whenever David took business trips. I powered on the machine. The screen glowed to life, casting a pale blue light across my face. I bypassed the boot sequence and launched my customized operating environment. The familiar command line interface populated the screen, a cascading waterfall of green text that instantly centered my racing thoughts. David considered himself cautious. He recently changed the passwords to our home network and locked me out of the shared cloud storage accounts, assuming those basic barriers would keep me isolated. He completely failed to realize that I wired this house. I built the entire network infrastructure from the ground up 6 years ago. I did not just know the back doors, I literally designed them. I plugged a high-gain wireless network adapter into my laptop and initiated a localized packet sniffing protocol. Within seconds, my screen flooded with real-time traffic data bouncing through the router located downstairs. I typed rapid commands, flawlessly executing a highly specialized script that directly targeted the main administrative portal. David updated the user credentials, but carelessly neglected to patch a critical firmware vulnerability I intentionally left open on the secondary access port. My software sliced right through his pathetic defense mechanisms in less than 40 seconds. I easily gained absolute unrestricted administrative control over the entire local area network. I sat quietly in the pitch dark, my fingers flying across the illuminated keyboard, completely invisible to the hostiles drinking champagne directly beneath my feet. With network access secured, I immediately pulled the historical router logs. David believed clearing his browser history and using private modes would erase his digital footprint. It was an incredibly amateur mistake. Every single website he visited, every server he connected to, and every encrypted packet he transmitted had to pass through the home router. I downloaded the massive log files directly onto an encrypted external drive. I deployed a specialized parsing tool to sift through the raw data, filtering out background noise from smart home devices. I instructed the software to isolate any traffic originating from David's primary devices. The parsing tool went to work organizing chaotic data into a readable format. I watched the results populate on my screen. The sheer volume of hidden activity was staggering. David accessed offshore banking portals, secure communication channels, and shell company registries late at night while I put our children to sleep. I tracked the IP addresses he frequented, cross-referencing them against global financial databases. I mapped out the digital pathways he utilized to communicate with Jamal, establishing a clear, undeniable pattern of coordinated activity. They exchanged thousands of encrypted data packets, likely transferring the forged documents. My eyes scanned the incoming data streams, meticulously analyzing the frequency and destination of his most recent internet traffic. He had spent an enormous amount of time connected to a specific corporate virtual private network, which I quickly identified as belonging to the very healthcare conglomerate where he served as chief financial officer. However, he was not just logging into the standard employee portal. He was completely bypassing the primary accounting servers and accessing highly restricted back-end financial gateways. The exact timestamps on these particular sessions perfectly aligned with the dates Jamal falsely claimed I was busy bankrupting our family. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my pulse quickening as the preliminary network analysis revealed the undeniable shape of a massive, highly sophisticated financial conspiracy. This was not merely the digital footprint of a cheating husband trying to hide his young mistress. This was the complex signature of a coordinated criminal enterprise. To unravel the exact specifics of their operation, I needed physical access to the localized data he stored on his hardware. The router logs provided the treasure map, but I still needed to dig up the actual chest. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet room. I glanced toward the bedroom door, ensuring it remained securely locked. I bypassed the outer perimeter of David's digital life without triggering a single security alarm. Now it was time to breach the inner vault and expose every toxic secret he thought he had successfully buried. I turned my attention away from the network traffic and prepared to initiate the next phase of my forensic extraction. I slipped out of the walk-in closet, leaving my forensic laptop humming quietly on the vanity. The router logs had pointed me toward the existence of a massive financial conspiracy, but network traffic only provided the map. I needed the actual payload. I needed local hardware. David was meticulous about his current devices. He always kept his primary smartphone locked in his pocket and his corporate laptop secured behind biometric scanners. But arrogance breeds oversight. He had completely forgotten about the old silver iPad sitting at the bottom of the toy chest in the nursery. David handed that tablet down to Leo and Mia months ago so they could watch animated shows on weekend mornings. He assumed that by deleting his work applications and signing out of his primary email client, the device was scrubbed clean. He viewed technology through the lens of a casual consumer, believing that dragging an icon to the digital trash bin meant the data was erased forever. He did not understand how flash memory actually functions. He did not know that operating systems aggressively cache authentication tokens, background sync data, and hidden application states. That forgotten piece of hardware was a ticking time bomb of digital evidence, and he had left it right inside my house. I crept silently down the hallway and slipped back into the nursery. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a star-shaped nightlight. I moved past the crib and reached into the woven storage basket overflowing with stuffed animals and wooden blocks. My fingers brushed against the smooth, cold aluminum chassis of the iPad. I pulled it out, gripping it tightly, and hurried back to the master bedroom, locking the door behind me once again. Sitting back down at my workstation, I retrieved a specialized data cable from my Pelican case. It was equipped with a hardware write blocker, a crucial forensic tool that allows a computer to read data from a target device without accidentally altering or overwriting a single byte of evidence. I plugged the lightning connector into the tablet and inserted the terminal end into my laptop. My forensic software immediately recognized the connected hardware. I bypassed the standard user interface, entirely dropping into a root-level command terminal to initiate a full physical dump of the logic board. I executed the extraction script. A bright green progress bar appeared on my screen, mapping the raw binary data as it flowed from the tablet into a secure container on my encrypted drive. The room was absolutely silent, except for the rhythmic, suppressed whirring of my laptop cooling fans. I watched the progress bar inch forward. 10%. 25%. The tension in my chest tightened with every passing second. If David or Jamal suddenly decided to come upstairs and check on me, they would find me orchestrating a massive data breach. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, mentally willing the extraction to move faster. 40%, 60%. The raw hex code scrolled furiously down the terminal window, representing gigabytes of fragmented memory. At 85%, the extraction momentarily stalled. The system hit a corrupted sector of the solid-state drive. My breath caught in my throat. I quickly typed a bypass command, forcing the software to image around the damaged blocks. The progress bar jumped to 90%, then 95%, and finally hit 100. The terminal displayed a solid green confirmation message. The physical image was successfully acquired. I instantly disconnected the tablet and shoved it under a pile of clothes, turning my absolute focus to the extracted data file. I mounted the file system image in a virtual sandbox environment. To the untrained eye, the directory looked completely mundane. It contained cartoon applications, downloaded games, and generic system files. But I deployed an aggressive data carving utility designed to scrape the unallocated space on the drive. When a user deletes a file, the system simply marks that space as available to be overwritten. Until new data actively writes over it, the original files remain completely intact, like ghosts lingering in the machine. My carving tool ripped through those digital ghosts, resurrecting fragments of David's past activity. The results began populating in my analysis window. The software painstakingly reconstructed deleted databases from various encrypted messaging applications David thought he had uninstalled. I watched as tables of chat histories, contact lists, and multimedia attachments materialized from the digital void. But reading old text messages was not my primary objective. I was hunting for the absolute holy grail of digital forensics, which are active authentication tokens. Devices linked to the same cloud ecosystem frequently share background security keys to keep user experiences seamless. If David had not explicitly revoked this specific device from his central cloud registry, the tablet's memory would still harbor valid session tokens. I ran a highly targeted script to parse the keychain data hidden deep within the system directory. The terminal flashed rapidly as it sifted through thousands of encrypted strings. Suddenly, the scrolling stopped. The software isolated a cluster of alphanumeric keys. My heart slammed against my ribs. It was an active authentication token for David's primary secure cloud storage account. He had neglected to force a remote logout. He left the back door wide open. I extracted the token and prepared to execute a session hijacking protocol. This technique let me inject the stolen security key directly into my own browser, tricking the remote server into believing my laptop was David's authenticated device. I opened a clean, masked browser instance routed through a proxy. I pasted the extracted sequence and hit enter. The loading icon spun on the screen. The entire universe seemed to hold its breath. 1 second passed, then 2. Suddenly the browser refreshed. The login screen vanished completely. In its place, a massive directory of highly organized encrypted folders materialized before my eyes. I now had total unfettered access to his live digital vault for the very first time. The folders were meticulously labeled, masquerading as mundane corporate archives. Quarterly projections, vendor analyses, structural audits, and compliance reports populated the screen in neat alphabetical rows. To a casual observer, it was the boring, highly organized digital briefcase of a dedicated chief financial officer, but I knew David better than he knew himself. He was driven by an obsessive, paranoid need for absolute control. He would never leave his darkest secrets to chance, nor would he trust a third party to manage his illicit data. I bypassed the standard financial reports and clicked directly into a heavily restricted directory titled Secondary Procurement Assets. The screen instantly flooded with hundreds of PDF invoices and unencrypted Excel spreadsheets. I opened the first file, bracing myself to find evidence of secret bank accounts or hidden marital assets he had concealed from me during our marriage. What I found was something infinitely more sinister. The spreadsheet detailed massive equipment purchases for the healthcare conglomerate where he served as an executive. The log showed expenditures for high-end magnetic resonance imaging machines, surgical robotics, and bulk pharmaceutical supplies. As a cybersecurity consultant, I frequently audited corporate networks for compliance and fraud detection. I was deeply familiar with standard medical billing structures and procurement protocols. My eyes darted across the columns of data. The vendor identification numbers looked entirely wrong. They lacked the standardized alphanumeric formatting used by recognized international medical suppliers. I opened a secondary terminal window on my laptop and ran a rapid automated lookup script on the registration data for these supposed healthcare vendors. The query results returned in a fraction of a second. The companies did not actually exist. They were phantom entities, empty shell corporations registered to a commercial mail receiving agency in Delaware. I wrote a rapid data extraction script to scrape every single spreadsheet hidden within the directory. I instructed my software to aggregate the numbers and calculate the total cumulative value of these fraudulent vendor payments over the past 3 years. I hit execute. The script tore through the data, processing thousands of rows of financial records in a rapid blur of digital activity. When the final output printed on my glowing screen, the breath vanished completely from my lungs. $3.5 million. David had not merely drained our joint savings to fund his infidelity and force my eviction. He had systematically embezzled $3.5 million directly from the hospital network he was hired to protect. The gravity of the situation was staggering. My husband was not just a coward and a cheat. He was a high-level federal criminal. He was actively diverting critical healthcare budgets into his own pockets while simultaneously standing in my living room, threatening to destroy my life over a fabricated lack of income. I needed to definitively prove the money flow to ensure the digital evidence was airtight. I dug much deeper into the cloud vault, deploying a search algorithm to locate international wire transfer logs. David had used the phantom Delaware corporations as his primary funnel to siphon the money out of the hospital systems. From there, he tumbled the stolen corporate funds through a complex web of offshore accounts located in Belize and the Cayman Islands. I watched the transaction histories cascade across my monitor. He had carefully layered the transfers, breaking the massive $3.5 million sum into smaller, irregular increments. It was a classic textbook technique known as smurfing, specifically designed to evade the mandatory reporting thresholds of the federal banking system. He clearly thought his elite financial acumen made him totally invisible to corporate auditors. He never anticipated his own wife conducting a forensic audit of his digital soul. I followed the electronic paper trail backward, tracking the flow of capital from the offshore tax havens directly back to domestic accounts. The laundered money had to resurface somewhere to be utilized. I cracked open a hidden subfolder containing his shadow banking statements and personal ledgers. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together with absolute clarity. I stared at digital receipts for a $10,000 designer handbag, a diamond tennis bracelet, and an extravagant corporate lease for a downtown luxury penthouse. I pulled up the exact serial numbers and item descriptions from the luxury retail invoices. They matched perfectly with the pristine trench coat, the sparkling jewelry, and the designer boots Brittany was currently wearing while standing on my Persian rug downstairs. David was not just cheating on me with a 25-year-old intern. He was actively financing Brittany's luxurious new lifestyle using millions of dollars in stolen corporate funds. He had drained the savings meant for our children's future merely as a cruel distraction, a smokescreen to leave me destitute while he played the billionaire sugar daddy with embezzled hospital money. The sheer blinding arrogance of his operation was beyond human comprehension. He stood in my home looking down his nose at me, acting like a righteous provider burdened by a useless wife. He was completely unaware that I was sitting locked in the bedroom right above his head, actively pulling the digital threads that would unravel his entire existence and land him in a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. My fear was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculated, and terrifying sense of power. I had uncovered his massive corporate fraud, but as I traced the routing numbers on the domestic side of the money laundering operation, my software highlighted a series of familiar authorization codes. I zoomed in on the local banking transfers David used to wash the final stage of the stolen cash. The data revealed an even darker, more twisted truth. David had not pulled off this massive financial heist alone. The final stage of David's money laundering scheme required integration into legitimate domestic assets. He needed to make the stolen corporate cash appear clean. My forensic software pulled the bank routing numbers connected to the domestic transfers and cross-referenced them against public corporate registry databases. The search algorithm returned a match for an active limited liability company named Vanguard Holdings Group. I dug into the corporate registration documents for the LLC. The operating agreement listed a single managing member with absolute executive control over the entity. The registered owner of Vanguard Holdings Group was Beverly. My mother-in-law was not just an arrogant woman who disliked me. She was the primary domestic funnel for $3.5 million in stolen corporate funds. David was utilizing Beverly as his primary money mule. He wired the laundered cash from the offshore accounts directly into the operating budget of her shell corporation. From there, Beverly dispersed the stolen funds, masking them as legitimate family loans and business investments. I downloaded the complete transaction history for Vanguard Holdings Group, tracing the disbursements. The data painted a terrifying picture of a deeply entrenched family crime syndicate. The records showed massive wire transfers from Beverly's shell company directed toward luxury car dealerships, high-end jewelers, and the leasing office for Brittany's downtown penthouse. But the most alarming transaction involved a massive influx of capital directed toward a specific local banking institution. The transfer logs indicated a highly irregular movement of assets related to real estate financing. I recognized the routing numbers immediately. It was the exact regional bank where my brother-in-law Jamal served as a senior credit director. I ran a deep dive analysis on the specific financial products associated with those transfers. The data revealed a series of highly complex, incredibly fraudulent mortgage modifications related to the deed of my house. David had initiated a title transfer to move the property entirely into Beverly's name. However, a transfer of that magnitude involving an active mortgage and a sudden change of ownership should have triggered massive fraud alerts within the banking system. It should have required my notarized signature, extensive identity verification, and rigorous compliance checks. The transfer should have been impossible to execute quietly. But David did not have to bypass the bank's security protocols because he had the ultimate inside man. Jamal had personally overseen and manually approved the fraudulent deed transfer. The digital signature on the banking authorization forms matched Jamal's executive credential ID perfectly. Jamal used his senior administrative access to override the automated fraud detection algorithms, suppress the mandatory compliance audits, and force the fraudulent property transfer through the system without triggering a single red flag. He essentially weaponized his prestigious banking position to steal my house and hand it directly to Beverly. Furthermore, Jamal utilized the fraudulent property transfer as a mechanism to wash the final wave of stolen cash. By manipulating the mortgage ledgers, he created a fabricated paper trail that made the influx of embezzled hospital money look like legitimate real estate equity. Jamal was the linchpin holding the entire domestic operation together. He was the corrupt banker facilitating the money laundering, while David was the corporate thief supplying the capital, and Beverly was the executive mule managing the distributions. The realization hit me with the force of an earthquake. The hostility I endured from Rachel and Beverly, the constant belittling from David, and the aggressive intimidation tactics from Jamal were not merely signs of a dysfunctional, toxic family. Their behavior was a calculated, synchronized defense mechanism. They were a sophisticated, organized criminal syndicate masquerading as an upper-class suburban family. They targeted me because I was an outsider, a disposable asset they could discard whenever I became inconvenient. They assumed my devotion to Leo and Mia made me weak and easily manipulated. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my devotion. My love for my children was not a weakness. It was the absolute core of my strength. They threatened to take my children, destroy my credit, and throw me onto the street. In doing so, they practically begged for total annihilation. I was no longer merely defending my marriage or fighting for my fair share of the assets. I was dismantling an active criminal enterprise to ensure the safety and future of my son and daughter. I sat in the quiet, darkened bedroom, the glowing screen illuminating my face. My fingers flew across the keyboard with lethal precision. I initiated a massive compilation protocol, organizing every single piece of extracted data into a comprehensive, undeniable digital dossier. I aggregated the router logs proving David's unauthorized access to the hospital's financial backend. I compiled the spreadsheets detailing the $3.5 million in fraudulent vendor payments. I mapped the entire international money flow, highlighting the specific offshore accounts and tracking the capital directly to Beverly's Shell Corporation. I included the irrefutable evidence of Jamal's banking fraud, capturing his digital signature, overriding the security protocols on my stolen house. I attached the luxury retail receipts, proving the stolen funds were actively financing Brittany's extravagant lifestyle. I built a bulletproof, mathematically perfect case against every single member of their syndicate. The compilation software finalized the dossier, packaging the massive volume of evidence into a highly encrypted, self-executing digital vault. The progress bar hit 100%. The dossier was complete. It contained enough raw, undeniable evidence to send David, Jamal, and Beverly to federal prison for decades. It possessed the power to permanently destroy Jamal's banking career, shatter David's corporate reputation, and reduce Beverly's aristocratic life to absolute ruin. I looked at the encrypted file resting on my desktop, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of absolute power. The weeping, defeated housewife they thought they had crushed was gone. The cybersecurity expert was fully armed, completely ruthless, and entirely ready to initiate the final sequence. The next 48 hours blurred into a sustained state of hyper-focused adrenaline. I barely slept. I fueled my body with black coffee, and whatever scraps of food I could quietly salvage from the kitchen while the rest of the house slept. The deadline they had given me was rapidly approaching. Wednesday morning dawned bright and clear, casting a warm, deceptive sunlight across the hardwood floors of the master bedroom. It was the third day. The day I was supposed to tuck my tail between my legs, pack a single sad suitcase, and drag my children out onto the street. Instead of packing, I sat perfectly still at the vanity, my eyes fixed on the glowing monitor of my tactical laptop. Through the slightly open window, the sharp, unmistakable sound of a champagne cork popping pierced the quiet morning air. It was followed immediately by a chorus of raucous cheers. I stood up and moved silently to the window, pulling the heavy curtain back just an inch. The scene unfolding in my backyard was a masterpiece of grotesque arrogance. They had arranged a lavish, celebratory brunch on the patio. David stood at the head of the teak outdoor dining table, pouring expensive vintage champagne into crystal flutes. Brittany clung to his side, wearing a flowing designer sundress purchased with the funds stolen from my children. Beverly sat in the plush wicker lounge chair, holding court like a victorious queen assessing her newly conquered kingdom. She raised her glass high in the air, offering a toast to her son and his new mistress. Rachel and Jamal clinked their glasses against David's, their faces split into wide, predatory grins. I watched Jamal lean back and laugh heartily at a joke David made, completely oblivious to the fact that his lucrative banking career was currently resting in a digital crosshair. They were celebrating their flawless execution of my demise. They were toasting to the brilliant, impenetrable financial fortress they believed they had built. Their laughter drifted up the side of the house, a toxic melody of pure, unchecked hubris. They thought I was upstairs weeping over empty cardboard boxes, utterly defeated by their superior intellect. I let the curtain fall shut, blocking out their sickening celebration. I returned to my workstation with absolute freezing clarity. The digital dossier was complete, but raw evidence was only half the battle. Delivery and execution were everything. I needed to ensure that once the strike was initiated, they would have absolutely zero capability to intercept, corrupt, or halt the data transfer. I opened a secure encrypted terminal and began constructing a specialized digital deadman switch. I routed the massive evidence payload through a series of heavily anonymized proxy servers. The destination addresses were hard-coded directly into the script. The first target was the Specialized White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I specifically formatted the data packets to bypass their standard intake filters and flag directly on the priority monitors of the Cyber Fraud Unit. The second target was the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Nothing destroys an organized syndicate faster than federal tax agents armed with undeniable proof of offshore money laundering and undeclared phantom assets. I verified the routing protocols 3 times, ensuring the data pathways were absolutely flawless. I set the trigger mechanism to a simple localized execution command on my encrypted smartphone. But sending them to prison was only the final step. I needed to witness the exact moment their arrogant illusions shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I needed them to know precisely who had outsmarted them. I tapped into the local area network one last time. I located the IP address of the massive 85-inch smart television mounted in the center of the living room downstairs. David loved that television. He bragged about its processing power and its seamless integration with the home network. I hijacked the television's primary display protocol, overriding its standard input commands. I configured my laptop to push a highly localized, unblockable screen, mirroring override directly to the living room display. I designed a simplified, devastatingly clear visual presentation of the dossier. I built a highly dynamic color-coded flowchart that painstakingly traced every single stolen dollar from the healthcare conglomerate straight through Jamal's fraudulent bank approvals, directly into Beverly's offshore shell corporation, and finally onto Brittany's sparkling wrist. It was a beautiful, lethal piece of digital art. I synchronized the display override with the federal data transmission script. One button press would simultaneously launch the evidence to the federal authorities and broadcast their entire criminal enterprise onto the massive screen in their own living room. I finally locked the digital payload and securely fastened the triggering application on my phone. The trap was now fully armed and completely inescapable. I systematically purged all residual cache files from my tactical laptop, initiating a secure wipe of the local operating environment to leave 0 forensic traces of my methodology. I shut down the machine, placed it back into the shock-proof Pelican case, and secured the latches. I slid the case back into the hidden wall cavity in the closet, replacing the baseboard trim so seamlessly that no one would ever know it had been disturbed. The digital architecture of their destruction was completely finalized. I walked back into the bedroom and calmly smoothed out the wrinkles in my shirt. Outside, the loud, obnoxious laughter of my husband and his accomplices continued to echo across the lawn. They were eating imported caviar and drinking expensive champagne, fully believing they had orchestrated the perfect crime. They believed they were the smartest people in the room. They thought the house belonged to them. They thought the money was clean. They thought they had entirely eliminated the threat. I stood by the bedroom door, my phone resting heavy and powerful in my pocket. The waiting was over. All I needed right now was the perfect moment to step downstairs and detonate the bomb. I stood by the bedroom door, my fingers grazing the smooth, cool metal of the smartphone, resting deep in my pocket. The raucous, self-satisfied laughter from the patio below suddenly fractured. A set of light, highly deliberate footsteps echoed loudly on the hardwood stairs. I quickly stepped away from the door, moving hurriedly toward the empty canvas suitcases I had staged intentionally on the floor. I grabbed a random handful of clothes and tossed them haphazardly inside, maintaining the perfect illusion of a defeated, broken woman packing her entire life away. The bedroom door swung wide open, hitting the wall. Brittany stepped boldly over the threshold, bringing the sharp, overwhelming scent of expensive floral perfume and the faint, sweet aroma of champagne into my private sanctuary. She did not look like a guest. She walked into the master bedroom with the arrogant, sweeping stride of a newly crowned monarch inspecting her acquired territory. A half-empty crystal flute dangled effortlessly from her manicured fingers. She took a slow sip, her eyes raking over the details of the room I had designed. The sunlight caught the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, the very bracelet I had tracked through the offshore money laundering accounts just hours prior. She wore it like a badge of honor, completely oblivious to the fact that it was a federal tracking beacon wrapping around her arm. Brittany sighed dramatically, running her free hand along the edge of my mahogany dresser. She told me the packing looked chaotic. She clicked her tongue in mock sympathy, shaking her head as she surveyed the meager pile of clothing I had tossed into the canvas bags. She paced further into the room, ignoring my presence, and began opening my closet doors. She casually flipped through the hangers, dismissing my wardrobe with a scoff. I stood still, letting my shoulders drop to feign submission. I watched her invade my personal space, allowing her inflated ego to dictate her every movement. She turned her attention to the centerpiece of the room. It was a handcrafted canopy bed David and I had purchased during our first year of marriage. Brittany ran her palm across the wooden post, a greedy gleam illuminating her eyes. She turned to me and issued a commanding directive. She informed me that I was forbidden from hiring movers to take the bedroom furniture. She stated that David promised she could redecorate the entire house, but she liked the vintage aesthetic of the master suite. She declared the bed the vanity, and the matching armoires would remain where they were because she intended to use them. The audacity of her demand was breathtaking. She was not just stealing my husband and my home. She wanted to sleep in my bed and stare into my mirrors while doing it. I kept my face devoid of emotion. I did not glare and I did not flinch. I lowered my gaze to the floor, presenting the image of a crushed, obedient victim. Behind my blank stare, my tactical mind recognized an unexpected opportunity. Brittany was openly claiming possession of high-value assets inside the property. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket, my thumb finding the volume button on my smartphone. I had pre-programmed a macro to execute via a double press of that button. I squeezed the button twice in succession. A tiny, imperceptible vibration confirmed the command was successful. A high-fidelity ambient recording application launched silently in the background. It immediately engaged an encrypted uplink to my remote cloud server. Every single word spoken in this room was now being captured and stored in a secure offshore data vault out of their reach. I needed her to keep talking. I needed her to establish her complicity and her knowledge of her newly acquired wealth. I looked up at Brittany and asked her a prompting question. I asked if David had already paid for the new renovations she planned to make. Brittany laughed, a bright sound that grated against the walls. She took another sip of her champagne and boasted about the massive budget David had allocated for her use. She bragged about the offshore accounts he had supposedly set up just to ensure she never had to worry about money again. She gloated about the corporate bonuses David claimed he received, detailing the amounts he promised to transfer into her private accounts by the end of the month. Every syllable she uttered was unadulterated evidence. She was providing a verbal confession of receiving illicit funds, tying herself directly to the financial timeline I had extracted from the router logs. She strutted across the room, her boots clicking on the wood. She stopped in front of me, invading my personal space just as Jamal had done the night before. Brittany looked me up and down with disgust. She told me I was obsolete. She said David needed a vibrant modern woman by his side to match his elite corporate status, not an exhausted freelancer who could not afford her own groceries. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She informed me that David had been planning to upgrade his life for over a year. She stated that transferring the house to Beverly was her idea, a strategy to ensure I walked away with nothing. My heart gave a powerful thump. She had just admitted to premeditated conspiracy to commit fraud. The audio file syncing to the cloud was now a lethal weapon. She smiled a malicious smile, telling me I should be grateful they were giving me $5,000 to disappear because I deserved to be left with zero. I maintained my absolutely deadpan expression, absorbing her incredibly toxic monologue with complete, icy detachment. I softly replied that I understood her cruel instructions completely. I quietly told her I would leave the heavy wooden furniture exactly as she had so arrogantly requested. Brittany beamed brightly with supreme satisfaction, truly believing she had just successfully bullied a defeated, helpless woman into total, unquestioning submission. She took one final, highly victorious gulp of her bubbly champagne, turned her back on me, and proudly strolled out of the master bedroom without offering a single backward glance. Her clicking footsteps retreated quickly down the long hallway, descending the stairs to eagerly rejoin the ongoing outdoor celebration. I pulled my phone out from my jacket pocket and calmly ended the hidden audio recording. The digital trap was now fully loaded, primed for execution, and it was finally time for me to walk downstairs and end this nightmare. I grabbed the heavy handles of the two small canvas suitcases I had packed earlier. They contained only a few basic necessities. I did not need to pack my actual life, because I was not going anywhere, but the props were essential for this final performance. I walked out of the master bedroom, the wheels of the luggage rolling across the hardwood floor. The sound of my approach preceded me. As I reached the top of the stairs, the raucous laughter from the backyard patio began to filter indoors, shifting from a distant echo to a present reality. The scent of catered food, cigar smoke, and spilled champagne wafted up the stairwell, creating a sickening contrast to the devastation they thought they had inflicted. I took a slow breath, centering my focus entirely on the mission at hand. I descended the steps one by one, letting my shoulders slump forward and keeping my gaze fixed firmly on the floorboards. I dragged the suitcases behind me, allowing them to bump awkwardly against the wooden stairs to announce my pathetic departure. By the time I reached the bottom step, the foyer was no longer empty. David stood directly in front of the heavy oak front door, completely blocking my only exit. He had removed his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive dress shirt to project an image of casual dominance. His face was flushed with alcohol and the intoxicating thrill of his perceived victory. He stood with his feet planted wide, assuming the physical stance of a conqueror, claiming his absolute territory. In his left hand, he held a sleek silver pen. In his right hand, he clutched the thick stack of divorce papers he had thrown at me the night before. I stopped at the base of the staircase, releasing the handles of my suitcases. I let my arms fall uselessly to my sides, painting a picture of total exhaustion and utter surrender. David looked me up and down, his eyes dripping with an aristocratic disgust that he had clearly inherited directly from his mother. David did not move aside to let me pass. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between us. He raised the divorce petition and slapped it firmly against my chest, forcing me to take hold of the heavy document or let it fall to the floor. I grasped the thick paper, keeping my head bowed in a show of total submission. David reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a freshly printed check. He held it right in front of my face, ensuring I could clearly see the amount written across the center line. $5,000. He snapped the paper between his fingers, creating a sharp, condescending sound that echoed in the entryway. He told me to look at the check closely. He declared it was my lucky day. David mocked my entire existence, stating that this meager sum was a highly generous parting gift to help me start my new garbage life. He laughed a cruel sound, claiming that $5,000 was far more than a useless freelancer actually deserved. He told me to sign the divorce papers right there in the foyer, relinquish all my parental and financial rights, and take the check as my final severance package. He framed the insulting bribe as an act of profound mercy, acting as if handing me a tiny fraction of the money he stole from our children was a heroic gesture of charity. Before I could formulate my calculated response, heavy footsteps echoed from the kitchen hallway. Jamal strolled into the foyer holding a glass of bourbon. He leaned his broad frame against the archway, swirling the amber liquid, while watching the scene unfold with malicious amusement. Jamal let out a loud, booming laugh that reverberated off the high ceilings. He pointed his glass at me, enjoying the spectacle of my fabricated misery. He told David he was being too generous. Jamal stated $5,000 was a monumental waste of capital on someone who did not understand basic interest rates. Jamal took a slow sip of his bourbon, his dark eyes locking onto me with predatory satisfaction. He stepped away from the archway and moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with my husband. The two of them formed a solid barricade of corrupt financial power. Jamal reminded me with glee that my credit profile was already a smoldering crater. He laughed about how effectively he had isolated my financial identity, boasting that no reputable institution would ever approve me for a basic checking account, let alone a residential lease. He told me I had absolutely no leverage left to fight them. He reiterated that I was completely destitute, entirely broken, and fundamentally powerless against a family backed by elite corporate wealth and institutional banking connections. Jamal sneered, advising me to take David's pathetic check before he decided to call in a few more favors and freeze that small amount of money, too. I stood frozen in the foyer, clutching the divorce papers in one hand and staring blankly at the $5,000 check David thrust into my face. The absolute sheer audacity of their performance was breathtaking. David was offering me $5,000 while actively laundering $3.5 million of stolen hospital funds through his mother's shell corporation. Jamal was bragging about destroying my credit while simultaneously acting as the corrupt inside man for a massive federal banking fraud scheme. They stood in my house entirely drunk on their own perceived invincibility, completely unaware that their entire criminal syndicate was currently sitting in a digital vault, waiting for my execution command. I kept my breathing shallow and my expression perfectly submissive. I needed them to feel completely untouchable. I needed their egos inflated to the absolute breaking point. I looked from David's smug face to Jamal's mocking grin, preparing to feed their fatal hubris with the exact questions required to trigger their final confession. I blinked, forcing my expression to remain perfectly blank, masking the rapid calculation happening behind my eyes. I looked down at the $5,000 check, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them feel powerful. I needed them to speak. I needed them to outline exactly how they had executed this flawless crime. I looked back up at David, making my voice tremble slightly, pitching it to sound like genuine, desperate confusion. I asked him how he had managed the property deed. I played the role of the financially illiterate wife, asking how it was even possible to transfer a house without my signature. The question was a carefully baited hook dangled right in front of a man whose ego was currently inflated to the size of a blimp. David took the bait immediately. He laughed loudly, a sharp, condescending sound that echoed in the foyer. He adjusted his stance, puffing out his chest, entirely eager to explain his brilliant maneuvering. He told me it was pathetic how little I understood about asset management. He boldly declared that forging my signature was the easiest part of the entire operation. He practically bragged about practicing the loops of my handwriting, claiming it took him less than 10 minutes to replicate it perfectly onto the quitclaim deed. He stated proudly that he had transferred the property title entirely into Beverly's name, ensuring the primary asset was shielded from any potential divorce settlement. He was speaking so loudly, his voice echoing off the hardwood floors, delivering a crystal-clear, completely voluntary confession of felony forgery and real estate fraud straight into my hidden microphone. I kept my face perfectly still, offering him a confused, almost admiring look to keep him talking. I shifted my gaze to Jamal, tilting my head slightly as if trying to grasp a complex concept. I asked how the bank could possibly approve such a massive transfer without flagging it. I told Jamal it seemed impossible to bypass the automated security protocols I assumed banks used. Jamal scoffed, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his bourbon. He stepped away from the archway, moving closer to ensure I fully understood the magnitude of his power. He told me I was incredibly naive if I thought automated protocols meant anything to a senior credit director. Jamal began detailing the exact loopholes he had exploited entirely drunk on his own perceived invincibility. He openly admitted to using his executive credential ID to manually suppress the mandatory compliance audits on the mortgage transfer. He boasted about overriding the fraud detection algorithms, explicitly stating that he had bypassed the identity verification requirements because he personally vouched for the transaction. Jamal laughed, claiming the bank's security systems were a joke to someone who knew the back-end architecture. He described how he had fabricated a secondary paper trail to make the transfer appear as a routine, low-risk familial asset reallocation, effectively washing the transaction clean within the banking system. He was providing a meticulous step-by-step breakdown of federal bank fraud, detailing his abuse of power with a smug, self-satisfied grin. I let my shoulders slump a little further, playing the part of the thoroughly overwhelmed victim. I looked back at David, asking one final crucial question. I asked how he planned to hide the money, mentioning that I knew about the accounts being drained. I feigned a tearful panic, asking if he was just going to leave me with absolutely nothing while he lived off our savings. David's eyes narrowed, his arrogance peaking. He sneered, telling me the money from the joint accounts was just pocket change compared to what he actually managed. He boldly admitted that the joint savings were merely a distraction, a way to keep me panicked and focused on pennies. He then took the final fatal step. He loudly bragged about the real capital, mentioning the lucrative corporate bonuses he had secured. He stated that those funds were safely tumbling through offshore accounts, entirely untraceable by any standard divorce attorney. David claimed he had established a bulletproof financial network, ensuring that the wealth he had accumulated would remain securely out of my reach, funding his new life with Brittany and his mother's investments. He was openly admitting to hiding massive illicit assets, confirming the exact money laundering pathways I had already mapped out in the digital dossier. Every word they spoke, every boastful detail of their criminal conspiracy was being captured perfectly by the high-fidelity recording application running silently on my smartphone. The audio files were instantly fragmenting and uploading to my secure cloud server in real time, creating an undeniable, legally binding record of their confessions. They stood in the foyer grinning at my apparent defeat, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just systematically dismantled their own defense and handed me the final necessary pieces of evidence to guarantee their absolute destruction. I kept my eyes lowered, clutching the divorce papers and the $5,000 check, patiently waiting for the audio upload to confirm completion. The trap was now fully armed, loaded with their own arrogant words, and it was time to initiate the strike. My hidden application confirmed the final data packet of their audio confession had successfully uploaded to my encrypted offshore server. The audio file was locked, sealed, and completely beyond their reach. The digital trap was now primed with their own arrogant admissions. I slowly looked down at the sleek silver pen resting in David's outstretched hand. He gave it a slight, impatient shake, silently demanding my absolute surrender. He expected me to sign away my marriage, my children, and my dignity right there in the foyer. I reached out my right hand. David's smug smile widened, revealing his teeth as he anticipated his ultimate victory. My fingers grazed the cool metal of the pen. I grasped it firmly and pulled it from his grip. I did not uncap it. I did not look down at the petition for dissolution of marriage resting on top of the fabricated credit card statements. Instead, I let my fingers relax. I opened my hand and let the heavy stack of legal documents slide from my grasp. They hit the floor with a loud thud, the pages scattering across the polished hardwood. The insulting $5,000 check fluttered down like a dead leaf, landing face down next to the legal papers. David blinked, his arrogant smile faltering slightly in confusion. Before he could process my blatant refusal, I raised my right hand and forcefully threw his expensive silver pen directly onto the floor. The metal casing cracked against the wood, bouncing away into the shadows of the hallway. The sharp clatter shattered the self-satisfied atmosphere they had carefully constructed. "What are you doing?" David demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, warning tone. Jamal immediately pushed himself away from the archway, his imposing frame tensing as he prepared to reassert his dominance over the situation. Rachel gasped loudly from the living room, offended by my sudden display of defiance. I ignored their rising irritation entirely. I reached into my jacket pocket and slowly pulled out my smartphone. I held it up, the screen glowing brightly in the dim light of the entryway. David took a step forward, his brow furrowing as he tried to comprehend my sudden shift in demeanor. He ordered me to pick up the papers. He threatened to call the police right that second if I did not comply. I looked David dead in the eyes, stripping away the pathetic weeping facade I had worn for the past 48 hours. My face was a mask of cold, calculated execution. I tapped the single red execution icon on my screen. Behind them in the center of the living room, the massive 85-inch smart television powered on with a sharp electronic chime. The sudden burst of vivid LED light illuminated the dark corners of the room, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. David, Jamal, Beverly, Rachel, and Brittany all spun around simultaneously, startled by the unexpected activation of the entertainment system. They expected to see a generic screensaver or a streaming menu. Instead, a stark high-resolution visual presentation materialized across the massive display. The screen was dominated by a highly detailed color-coded financial flowchart. At the very top, in bold, inescapable lettering, read the title of the presentation. It was labeled Corporate Embezzlement and Domestic Money Laundering Syndicate. Below the title, the screen was divided into ruthless, undeniable sections of criminal evidence. I watched their eyes dart frantically across the display as their brains struggled to process the nightmare unfolding before them. A thick red line originated from a box displaying the exact logo of David's healthcare conglomerate. The line connected directly to a series of PDF images. These were the fake vendor invoices David had generated to siphon the $3.5 million out of the hospital budgets. The fraudulent Delaware registration numbers were magnified for absolute clarity. From there, the digital map flowed downward, charting the complex smurfing operation through the offshore tax havens. David took a staggered step backward, his face draining of all color as he stared at his own hidden offshore account numbers projected in massive high-definition font. The flowchart branched out, highlighting the domestic return of the laundered cash. A bright blue section illuminated Jamal's regional bank branch. Projected right next to the bank logo was Jamal's personal executive identification code, stamped directly onto the unauthorized fraudulent mortgage transfer of my house. The screen explicitly detailed how he bypassed the compliance audits, proving his direct involvement in federal bank fraud. Jamal froze entirely. His mouth hung open, his breathing stopped, and his dark eyes widened in sheer panic as he read the irrefutable proof of his ruined career. The red lines continued their relentless march across the screen, converging on a large central box labeled Vanguard Holdings Group. Below the company name was a high-resolution scan of the corporate operating agreement featuring Beverly's verified signature as the sole managing member of the Shell Corporation. The chart meticulously documented the massive influx of stolen hospital funds entering her accounts. Finally, bright yellow arrows branched out from Beverly's shell company, pointing directly to high-definition scans of luxury retail receipts. The receipts detailed the exact serial numbers of the diamond tennis bracelet currently sparkling on Brittany's wrist, and the lease agreement for her downtown luxury penthouse. Brittany let out a small, strangled gasp, instinctively covering her diamond bracelet with her other hand, as if trying to hide the physical evidence of her complicity. Beverly stood absolutely paralyzed by the patio doors. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her manicured fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. The sound of the breaking glass was the only noise in the entire house. Nobody jumped. Nobody screamed. Nobody moved a single muscle. A dead, suffocating, deeply terrified silence descended upon the room. The smug predators who had just spent the last 3 days torturing me finally realized they had walked blindly into an inescapable slaughterhouse. David snapped. The sheer magnitude of the exposed financial crimes entirely shattered his arrogant, untouchable facade. His shock mutated instantly into blind, unadulterated panic. He let out a guttural, frantic sound that was half rage and half terror. He lunged across the Persian rug, moving with desperate speed toward the massive 85-inch television mounted in the center of the living room. He blindly grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the media console and swung it with all his might. The heavy metal crashed directly into the center of the delicate LED screen. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The glass spiderwebbed instantly, radiating jagged lines across the surface. The vibrant color-coded flowchart depicting his massive federal crimes warped into chaotic, colorful static before the display died completely, plunging that side of the room back into shadows. David stood there, his chest heaving violently, his knuckles white as he gripped the makeshift weapon. He stared at the broken black glass, breathing heavily, as if destroying the physical monitor had somehow magically erased the digital footprint of his extensive corporate felonies. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply stood at the base of the staircase, my posture perfectly straight, and watched him exhaust his sudden burst of violent adrenaline. I looked at the shattered television and then back to my husband. I spoke with a voice completely devoid of emotion, cutting cleanly through his frantic, ragged breathing. I coldly informed him that destroying a piece of hardware was a profoundly useless gesture. I calmly explained the basic concept of screen mirroring, letting him know that the television was merely a local display output. I told him the presentation he just saw was hosted on a heavily encrypted remote cloud server located thousands of miles away. I stated that the actual data, the raw files, the offshore routing numbers, and the forged invoices were entirely untouched, safely secured behind military-grade firewalls he could never hope to breach. The brass candlestick slipped from David's trembling hand. It hit the hardwood floorboards with a dull, heavy thud. His eyes widened as the reality of his absolute powerlessness truly set in. I took a deliberate step forward into the living room, actively commanding the space that they had tried so hard to strip away from me. I turned my attention away from my husband and looked directly at Beverly, Rachel, and Jamal. I proceeded to dismantle the pathetic, arrogant illusion they had been operating under for the past 3 days. I told them that my tears, my desperate begging, and my sudden compliance were nothing more than a highly calculated performance. I revealed that while they were clinking champagne glasses on the patio, toasting to their new house, and mocking my supposed financial incompetence, I was systematically ripping apart their entire digital existence. I explained exactly how I used the forgotten tablet in the nursery to bypass David's pathetic network security. I detailed how effortlessly I traced the laundered hospital funds from the offshore tax havens directly into Beverly's fraudulent shell corporation. I shifted my gaze to Jamal. The senior credit director was sweating profusely. I watched the arrogant banking executive visibly crumble before my eyes. I told him I had captured his specific executive authorization codes, bypassing the compliance audits on the mortgage transfer of my house. I let him know his lucrative banking career was not just over, it was actively being converted into a federal indictment. I glanced at Brittany, who was now shrinking back against the wall, clutching her designer trench coat in sheer terror. I informed her that the luxury funds financing her brand new lifestyle were flagged as stolen corporate assets. Every piece of jewelry, every luxury car payment, and every rent check tied to her name was now classified as physical evidence in a massive federal money laundering investigation. David stepped forward, holding his hands up. He tried to speak, attempting to formulate some kind of desperate last-minute negotiation to save himself. I immediately cut him off. I told him there was absolutely nothing left to negotiate because I no longer held the leverage. I explained that I had not just compiled the digital dossier for my own personal amusement. I had packaged the raw data, the offshore banking records, the forged corporate invoices, and the live audio recording of their brazen confessions from minutes ago into a self-executing encrypted file. I revealed the ultimate destination of that massive data transfer. I slowly lifted my left arm, pulling back the sleeve of my jacket to expose my watch. I stared at the dial, watching the second hand tick forward with precise, unstoppable momentum. I announced to the paralyzed room that the fully unredacted dossier had not just been sent. I coldly informed them it had been sitting on the active priority monitors of the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division for exactly 48 hours. I added that a secondary data packet was simultaneously delivered directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, ensuring that their undeclared offshore assets would trigger an immediate catastrophic federal tax audit. I emphasized the timeline. 48 hours, 2 full days. I explained that 48 hours was more than enough time for federal agents to verify the routing numbers, cross-reference Jamal's banking credentials, secure judicial subpoenas, and freeze every single domestic and offshore account tied to their names. I calmly informed them that the $5,000 check lying on the floor, the money they had offered me as an insulting bribe to abandon my own children, was now drawn from an account that had already been permanently locked down by the federal government. They had absolutely zero financial resources left. The atmospheric pressure in the room plummeted. The sheer, inescapable scale of their impending doom paralyzed them completely. They had spent the last 3 days gleefully orchestrating a cruel, petty domestic eviction, completely oblivious to the fact that they were the primary targets of a massive, actively mobilizing federal sting operation. David dropped heavily to his knees on the Persian rug, his hands clutching his head as he stared blankly at the floor. Jamal backed away slowly until his shoulders hit the wall, muttering under his breath that his life was completely over. Beverly clutched her chest, struggling to breathe, as the terrifying reality of a federal prison sentence washed over her aristocratic facade. I stood perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of the syndicate that had tried to destroy me, knowing the authorities were already closing in. The oppressive, heavy silence in the living room shattered entirely as a faint, high-pitched wail drifted through the quiet neighborhood. The distant sound rapidly multiplied, transforming into a chaotic, overlapping chorus of heavy sirens tearing down the suburban street. I watched the exact moment the realization struck my husband. The color completely drained from David's face as the deafening wail of federal law enforcement vehicles converged directly outside our property. Harsh, alternating beams of red and blue light violently sliced through the front windows, casting rapid, dizzying shadows across the shattered television screen and the Persian rug. The flashing strobes painted the terrified faces of the family syndicate, illuminating their absolute, inescapable doom. The time for negotiations, bribes, and arrogant threats had officially expired. Heavy synchronized footsteps pounded onto the front porch, accompanied by the distinct screech of tires tearing up the manicured lawn in the backyard. They did not bother ringing the doorbell. The heavy oak front door exploded inward with a deafening crash, the frame splintering into jagged pieces of wood as a battering ram obliterated the lock. Simultaneously, the glass patio doors in the kitchen shattered into thousands of pieces as a secondary tactical team breached the rear perimeter. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and protective vests flooded into the house like a tidal wave of uncompromising justice. The blinding beams of tactical flashlights pierced the dim lighting of the foyer, accompanied by thunderous, overlapping commands ordering everyone to get down on the ground immediately. David let out a primal, panicked scream. Driven by sheer mindless terror, he scrambled to his feet and blindly lunged toward the hallway, desperately trying to find an exit that no longer existed. He barely managed 2 steps before 3 heavily armored FBI agents tackled him simultaneously. The impact sent him crashing violently onto the hardwood floor, his face smashing directly into the scattered pages of the divorce petition he had tried to force me to sign. An agent planted a heavy boot squarely between David's shoulder blades, pinning him to the floor while grabbing his wrists. The cold metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed sharply. David thrashed against the floorboard, screaming my name, begging me to call them off completely, forgetting he had just spent 3 days trying to destroy my entire existence. The lead agent hauled him up roughly by the back of his collar, reading his Miranda rights while David continued to weep uncontrollably. Across the room, the untouchable, arrogant facade of the senior credit director evaporated completely. Jamal did not attempt to run. His legs simply gave out. He collapsed heavily onto his knees, raising his trembling hands high above his head in an act of total, pathetic surrender. As 2 federal agents approached him, Jamal began to hyperventilate, loudly sobbing and stammering out desperate pleas for mercy. He babbled frantically, offering to turn state's evidence, promising to testify against David and Beverly if they would just let him call his bank executives. The arresting agent ignored his pathetic bargaining, completely twisting Jamal's arms behind his back and snapping the cuffs shut. The agent loudly informed Jamal he was being placed under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and severe violations of federal banking regulations. Jamal wept like a broken child. His prestigious banking career reduced to a humiliating spectacle of cowardice on my living room floor. Near the broken patio doors, Beverly reacted with sheer, unadulterated, aristocratic entitlement. As a female federal agent reached out to apprehend her, my mother-in-law slapped the agent's hand away, shrieking at the top of her lungs. She screamed that this was a terrible mistake, loudly demanding to speak to the chief of police, claiming she was a respected member of the community who could not be treated like a common street criminal. Her frantic resistance earned her no sympathy. Two agents swiftly grabbed her arms, forcing her against the wall to subdue her. Beverly shrieked in absolute horror as the cold steel locked around her wrists. The agent loudly declared she was under arrest for the operation of a fraudulent shell corporation and massive domestic money laundering. The elegant, commanding matriarch who had handed me an eviction notice with a smug smile was now a disheveled, hysterical prisoner being dragged out of her own fraudulent property. Rachel stood frozen near the staircase, sobbing uncontrollably as an agent ordered her to face the wall. She had been a willing accomplice, a cheerleader for my destruction, and now she was getting swept up in the federal net. But the most satisfying reaction belonged to Brittany. The young intern stood trapped in the center of the chaos, her eyes darting wildly around the room. An agent holding a digital inventory tablet approached her, flashing a badge. The agent coldly informed Brittany that the luxury vehicle parked in the driveway, the designer trench coat she was currently wearing, and the expensive jewelry adorning her body were all classified as federal evidence purchased with stolen corporate funds. The terrifying reality crashed into Brittany's mind. She was not a wealthy executive's pampered girlfriend. She was an active participant in a major felony. Brittany stared down at the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, her chest heaving in sheer panic as she realized every single luxury item she owned was about to be stripped away, leaving her facing the very real possibility of a prison sentence for receiving stolen property. She began to cry hysterically, her dreams of a penthouse lifestyle evaporating into the flashing red and blue lights. I remained standing perfectly still by the wooden base of the staircase, completely untouched by the heavily armed tactical units actively swarming the property. I carefully watched the federal agents systematically dismantle the entire criminal syndicate that had aggressively tried to steal my children and permanently ruin my life. I felt absolutely no pity, no remorse, and no lingering guilt. I just watched their arrogant empire burn. 6 months have passed since the night the flashing red and blue lights illuminated my living room walls. The deafening chaos of the federal raid feels like a distant lifetime ago. The shattered glass of the massive television was swept up long ago, replaced by a beautiful, unblemished screen. The heavy oak front door that was splintered by the battering ram has been replaced with a reinforced steel core door, painted a crisp white. The suffocating tension that once poisoned the air inside this house has evaporated. In its place is a profound, undeniable peace. The storm did not break me. It merely washed away the debris of a fabricated life, leaving a solid foundation built entirely on truth. The federal justice system moves with terrifying mechanical efficiency when presented with an airtight, self-executing digital dossier. There were no protracted legal battles or dramatic courtroom standoffs. The evidence I provided was so comprehensive, so mathematically perfect, that their highly priced defense attorneys practically begged for plea deals the moment discovery completed. David sat in a federal courtroom wearing a bright orange jumpsuit stripped of his tailored suits and corporate arrogance. The judge showed zero leniency for a man who embezzled millions from a healthcare system while actively attempting to leave his own children homeless. David was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. He will be almost 50 years old when he finally breathes free air again. Jamal suffered a similarly devastating downfall. The banking executive who bragged about manipulating federal algorithms learned exactly how unforgiving those systems can be. The regulatory boards permanently revoked his banking licenses, ensuring he will never work in the financial sector again. He received an 8-year federal prison sentence for conspiracy and bank fraud. Rachel filed for divorce the moment the handcuffs clicked onto his wrists, desperately trying to salvage her own reputation. But the social fallout was absolute. They lost their home, their status, and their future. Beverly did not escape the crushing weight of her own hubris. The aristocratic matriarch who sneered at me from her wicker lounge chair wept openly as the judge handed down a 5-year sentence for operating a fraudulent shell corporation and domestic money laundering. Her country club memberships were revoked. Her assets were seized. The pristine image she valued above her own family was permanently obliterated. As for Brittany, the young intern quickly realized her designer trench coat and diamond tennis bracelet could not protect her from federal indictment. She turned state evidence to avoid prison time, surrendering every single luxury item David bought her. She walked away with absolutely nothing, returning to her parents' house in utter disgrace. While their empire crumbled into ash, my life expanded in ways I never thought possible. By meticulously tracking the offshore routing numbers and exposing the phantom medical vendors, I did not just save myself from an illegal eviction. I acted as a certified whistleblower for the federal government. The Internal Revenue Service operates a highly specific program for individuals who expose massive tax fraud and international money laundering. Because my digital dossier directly led to the recovery of $3.5 million in stolen corporate funds, I was awarded a substantial whistleblower bounty. The financial reward was massive, easily surpassing the life savings David tried to steal from me. Furthermore, the fraudulent quitclaim deed David and Jamal orchestrated was immediately voided by a federal judge. The court recognized me as the victim of severe financial identity theft. Not only was the house legally returned to my sole ownership, but the remaining mortgage balance was entirely wiped clean, using the recovered assets as restitution for the emotional and financial damages inflicted upon me. I own this property free and clear. The very house they tried to kick me out of is now an impenetrable fortress for my children. I step out onto the master bedroom balcony, the morning air crisp and refreshing against my skin. I hold a warm mug of coffee in my hands, taking a slow, deep sip as I look down at the sprawling backyard below. The patio where they once toasted to my destruction is now completely transformed. Leo and Mia are running across the freshly cut grass, their bright, joyful laughter echoing beautifully through the tall trees. They are chasing a colorful kite, completely unaware of the massive hidden war their mother fought to secure their happiness. They are safe, they are protected, they are deeply loved forever. I lean against the wooden railing, closing my eyes and letting the warm sunlight wash over my face. The absolute freedom I feel right now is intoxicating. I no longer have to shrink myself to fit into a mold created by a toxic mother-in-law. I no longer have to tolerate the gaslighting of an unfaithful criminal husband. I took my life back with my own 2 hands. I weaponized the very skills they mocked, and I used them to carve out a beautiful, uncompromising future for myself and my sweet children. Family is supposed to be your ultimate safe haven, but biology does not give anyone the right to abuse, manipulate, or destroy you. You do not have to accept betrayal just because it comes wrapped in the guise of family loyalty. Sometimes cutting out a toxic tumor is the absolute only way to survive and truly heal. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member who tried to manipulate you? Did you ever uncover a massive secret that completely changed your entire reality? Please share your story in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and your courage might inspire someone else to finally stand up for themselves. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button for more stories of justice, resilience, and ultimate revenge. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. Remember, your peace is always worth fighting for, no matter what the cost may be. Riley's story teaches a profound lesson about the indestructible nature of self-worth and independence. When we sacrifice our identities to fit someone else's narrative, we become deeply vulnerable to their toxicity. This journey reminds us that true power doesn't come from the approval of a manipulative family or a deceitful partner, but from within. Her hidden expertise represented her unyielding inner strength. When pushed to rock bottom, she didn't break, she fought back. Never allow anyone to erase your capabilities or diminish your value. Take charge of your narrative, stand strong in your truth, and share your own stories of reclaiming your independence in the comments below.